Welcome to Northwest Tech Show. I'm Dave Duncan, and this is the show where we talk about technology and how a better understanding of it can lead to better technologically enhanced outcomes at home, at work, and in your civic engagements. We're going to kick things off, as we like to do, with a bit of Creative Commons content by the good folks at twit.tv. This is Tech News Weekly 41, Journalism and the Blockchain.
This is Twit.
This week, the nonprofit software company Civil announced that you can register to buy a form of cryptocurrency called Civil tokens that will be available for an August 13th offering. If you have no idea what that means, you might want to subscribe to the new Zigzag podcast, which is working with Civil, partly supported by Civil, and explains how Civil and the blockchain work, while also somehow changing the course of journalism, capitalism, and women's lives, plus solving the problem of hot sauce trolls. Our next guest is here to talk about how she is building her podcast on the blockchain. Welcome, Manoush Zomorodi.
Oh, it's so great to be back, Megan. I've missed you so thank you for having me. God, you just made my podcast sound like a mush.
Well, you can clear that. You can clear that up for us. So, like you said, we've spoken a few times. You used to host the Note to Self podcast. Now you've gone out on your own, which means I get to talk to you directly to book this. You don't have a special assistant anymore, which is one of the differences.
Better or worse.
Tell us a little bit. Give your better elevator pitch of Zigzag.
So my executive producer of the podcast that you mentioned, Note to Self, she and I were thinking it was time to go out on our own for lots of reasons. And we ended up talking to some folks over at Civil, which is, as you mentioned, a startup that is using blockchain to try and create an ecosystem, a decentralized ecosystem for journalism, where advertising money is not the point. People aren't having to go for clicks. They're not having to go through Mark Zuckerberg to get people's eyeballs. The idea is that, can we find investigative local news and give them a place to flourish? Now, how do you pay for all that to begin with? Well, that's where Consensus, which is founded by Joe Lubin, he's one of the co-creators of the Ethereum blockchain. He has created this place, Consensus, where they are funding a bunch of projects, one of which is Civil. And so we were talking to them, and they said, you know, we think you might actually be a good fit for this weird project that we're developing. We can give you a grant to get started. What do you want to cover? And we said, well, actually, we want to cover you, because this is the weirdest project we have ever heard of. And being part of it is kind of a weird meta mashup for us, where we are actually documenting in real time as this startup gets up and running, and essentially tries to convince mainstream America that they should get on the blockchain, which is no easy task.
I love your, you go through and ask people, just regular people, what they think of it, and it's just what you'd expect. Like, I know what a block is, and I know what chains are. And you do some great metaphors. I mentioned the hot sauce trolls, and hot sauce is one of the ways you explain what the blockchain is and how it works. You also use a guy who sings a little song, which I still can't get out of my head weeks later.
Earworm, I'm sorry about that. Yeah.
Do you want to give a little explanation of what the blockchain is in terms of hot sauce?
Well, you know, I think that like your listeners probably know that blockchain is a technology that makes Bitcoin work. But actually, most people don't realize that Bitcoin and blockchain are related. So we have to just start with the real basics. And then talking about, you know, that blockchain is this idea of a string of computers, a necklace of computers that are all sharing information. And there are various blockchains all around. For some reason, most people say on the blockchain, which is like being on Sesame Street. I'm not really sure why that has happened, but so we have to sort of explain that. But the hot sauce thing that you're talking, that's the intermediate version of blockchain. We got really hot and heavy into TCRs. So those of you who don't know what a TCR is, that's okay. It's a token curated registry. And that's the idea of creating a mini economy, right? Where there's a cryptocurrency at the heart of it, where people don't have to use, again, ad dollars, right? What they're trying to get people to do, and what they announced yesterday, was that if you buy a civil token, you then become sort of a player, a donator, a patron in this ecosystem for news. And you can do lots of different things with that token. You can do micro tipping eventually. You can vote to make sure that real good journalism is on the platform. You can also vote to get bad journalism off the platform. Or you can also stake your tokens and start your own website, your own mini media empire. I should clarify, though, I am not a spokesperson for Civil. I am not sure this is going to work. Full stop. But what I do think is very interesting about it, as someone who has really been on this like tech and ethics beat, this is the dawn of a new technology. Imagine if we had had this conversation with consumers when the internet started. Maybe we wouldn't be in the, I was going to say a bad word, fest that we're in right now. I mean, I think there needs to be a new conversation between technologists and consumers so that we build the tech that we really want. And that's what I saw as a sort of narrative opportunity with Civil.
Yeah, and opportunity being the key word. I feel like blockchain as an idea, as a concept, is very, like you said, very misunderstood. People have a hard time really understanding what blockchain even means. And yet it's entirely possible that 10 years from now, the concept of blockchain and everything that's built around it will seem as normal as the internet does now. When the internet first came out, a lot of people were scratching their heads because they just didn't quite understand it, right? We're at that beginning, that kind of inflection point where this new technology may be confusing, but there's tons of opportunity there. So it's awesome to be in a position where you can kind of put your money or your coin where your mouth is, but that also comes with a lot of risk, right? You mentioned that your operating budget is kind of half actual money and half waiting for Civil coins to sell. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the grant that we got from Civil was half normal money and half tokens. And so that meant that we didn't know what that token amount was going to be. And did we have visions of Lamborghinis in our minds? Maybe a little bit, or at least enough that we could hire a couple people, right, to get our business off the ground. But yesterday in their announcement, Civil spelled out very specifically the parameters around the sale of the token, and they are extremely strict and conservative. And my impression is that the reason why they are so strict and conservative is because they don't want to be lumped in with the hundreds of ICOs that are fraudulent or preying on people who are maybe placing too much of their own money down, betting that this might be a get-rich scheme, that they certainly don't want to be regulated as a security. Like, there's a real deep belief in the people making this stuff that this is a way to create a utility. This is about creating an ecosystem for journalism. So how do you do that? You have the hard cap for the token sale is very modest. They are not looking to make a ton of money. What they want is to play the long game and see if they can make this thing fly. There's also an arduous task that you have to go through in order to register for these tokens. They do not want people just being like, let's see if we can get rich. You have to take a quiz, which I failed. So as someone who actually has been immersed in this, I failed because I didn't know the difference between a hot and cold wallet. Do you guys know the difference between a hot and cold?
I didn't even know.
Totally new tab.
I didn't even know there were hardware wallets. There was such a thing as hardware wallets till I listened to your podcast about hardware wallets.
It's a whole new world. And so I think that's why we're kind of the perfect proxy, because this is not easy stuff, but that's what their whole point is. They want people who are going to care very deeply about getting this thing off the ground. And if you can't sort of put in the time, they don't want your money either, which is admirable. But what if there aren't enough people who come and buy the tokens? That's my concern.
So if I believe like that journalism is in a scary place right now, and I've believed for a long time that journalists need to be paid more, and it's, and there needs to be a way for good and honest media to survive. Is that why, and I figure out what a hot and cold wallet is that why I would invest? But would I also invest because I think maybe I believe in that, and also it could be a way that I could put my kids through college?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Not the last part. The first part, absolutely. Okay. You are maybe not happy about certain heads of state yelling at members of the press and calling them fake. You don't necessarily think that that Facebook, the duopoly as they're often referred to, should be the ones deciding how and where we get our news. And maybe you miss the fact that there was a local newspaper in your community and there isn't one anymore. And somebody needs to be keeping track of what the politicians are up to. So that would be the reasons why you would want to do it. And look, if you decide the token thing is not your bag, it's cool. Like not everybody goes on Wikipedia and wants to update the essays and the information on there, right? Some people just go to read, and that's fine too. So I think the hope is that a regular person might say, you know what, I do care about news and journalism. It's a fundamental pillar of democracy, and I feel a little bit empowered to do something about it. So maybe I'll put down $100 and see what this civil thing's about, and at least show my support and also educate myself and maybe learn about this blockchain thing. They are, by the way, going to be offering free webinars and having a free hotline. So they really are working hard to be one of the most effective or I guess accessible consumer-facing blockchains ever. So there's free education here too. So I think it's a good, worthy experiment.
So you would compare this maybe to something like, subscribing to like a newspaper online, even though you could get it free, but not the same as like changing everything in your IRA to like a socially conscious fund. Like you wouldn't compare it to that. Like don't go in this with your life savings.
Well, they won't let you. The protections that they have in place, they are being so cautious about making sure that this is there's a consumer protection element to this, that's not even an option. They won't take your money. So I would say contribute or buy some tokens because you're curious, because you believe in good journalism, because you want to learn something, and because maybe you want to make sure that if there's one thing you can do, it's put a little bit of money where your mouth is, that you care about these things. But I think those are really good reasons to be part of it. It's why I've decided to be part of it. And I hope, playing the long game pays off, and not in money.
But that wouldn't hurt.
Yeah.
Well, sure. I mean, that'd be great. Like right now, there's 2 of us in this little office behind me. Like that would be nice to add a couple of people for sure.
Absolutely.
Not to get a Lambo, it's fine.
Well, we haven't even really talked about the podcast, which is good because talking about a podcast is not as good as listening to the actual podcast.
Sure.
So I love that you're halfway through episode 7, dropped today. Go to Apple Podcasts, subscribe to it, go to wherever you get your podcast. It's Zigzag Pod, and definitely listen. You guys, I loved your episode 5, Men, Women, and Vulnerability, where you talked to Alex Bloomberg, who did a similar experiment, leaving his job and starting Gimlet Media. And so, yeah, it's interesting to see whether gender really changes the story there. So,
what do you think, Megan? Does it?
Yeah, of course. Gender always changes the story.
Yeah.
I think.
Yes.
Not necessarily, either way. It's just not, it affects it in one way or the other. Like technology, it's
neither good, not neutral, ever.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Manoush, thank you so much. You can find Manoush at ManoushZ on Twitter. And where's the Zigzag Pod the best place to send people?
Yeah, or like you said, wherever you listen to podcasts, search for Zigzag. Take a listen. We'd love to hear from you, and join this fun community that cares about journalism.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Manoush.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you both.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. I'm Dave Duncan, and that was a clip from Twit.tv. That was Tech News Weekly 41, Journalism and the Civil block coin. And you might also search under Zigzag for more information on that. And for those following along in the home game, the answer to the hot wallet versus cold wallet is whether it's online. So you can't hack a wallet that's not online. So if it's if all the data related to the wallet is in some sort of storage device that is not connected to the internet, that is a cold wallet. So the idea is you keep your reserves in cold wallet that you don't need day to day, and then you have your hot wallet, which is the one that's actually connected to the internet at the time that you are making a purchase. So you can disconnect from the internet and make transfers between your hot wallet and cold wallet, temporarily turning your hot wallet cold, etc. And I have not had the privilege of actually having either a cold or hot wallet. I had the store your coins on as a balance on someone else's machine, and they have the wallet, and that was Mt. Gox. But what are you going to do? It was the biggest exchange at the time. Later found out that the formidable name of Mt. Gox actually stood originally for Magic the Gathering, was the MTG, and then online exchange or something like that. So you can't always judge a site by its name, but a lot of people did. It's early days. It's still early days for Bitcoin, for the blockchain in general. And we're still finding our way. Now, as in a lot of things where where you take something old and add the word computer or technology or blockchain in front of it, a lot of the old problems come up again. If you're doing online currencies, then all the games that people used to play with currencies before they became regulated or well understood come up again. There's all sorts of little edge cases where people don't understand exactly how it works. You have some really sophisticated methods for stealing out there. I thought the one that was the most hilarious one was these Bitcoin address that you're sending some Bitcoin to. It's this big, long, hairy hexadecimal number. And so you go, okay, fine. I'm going to copy and paste that number into my spending program, which is totally bulletproof and and secured by NASA and whatever. And what someone did is they actually made a bit of malware that just sits there watching the clipboard, and if it sees something like a Bitcoin wallet address, it when you copy it, then when you go to paste it, it substitutes its own Bitcoin wallet of the hackers, of the malware authors, as the destination. So you think you're sending it to, support journalists or something like that, and it actually goes to support hackers. Support their Lamborghini habit, as was referenced there. But I should not. I kind of exhibited a bad habit there. Hackers does not mean criminals. Hackers just means people that understand the technology a bit better than the other folks, and usually have a highly developed sense of curiosity about it. And just like anyone else, some of them can be hackers, but for the most part, it's just a couple of bad dudes that understand technology, and then everyone else that is just criminals that are copying the smart bad guys. And a whole network of dumb bad guys, aka the script kiddies, follow on in their wake. So I'm reminded of that distinction because we just had the Hackers on Planet Earth conference in New York City this past weekend. I've been watching some of the footage of that from live stream. If you go on live stream and search for Circle of Hope, you can find a lot of that material. And it's a lot of good knowledge being dropped. In one example, person I'm actually acquainted with was gave a talk where he was monitoring the registrations on the in the DNS system and discovered some interesting patterns about surrounding a certain political campaign in 2015 that were very interesting, and is going to be proactively monitoring the midterm election for similar registrations to, help be part of the smart guys keeping things honest, which is really nice to see, and was also doing some pro bono work to help out the children that were incarcerated on the border. So, hackers do good stuff with their knowledge, or neutral stuff by and large. And I am a big fan of individual empowerment that the knowledge they spread represents.
Aren't hackers separated into two groups, white hats and black hats?
Some people choose to separate them such, yes.
Okay, just curious.
So I would, so they, it's like just in like the old cowboys and Indians movies, good guys and bad guys. And some guys switch hats periodically. I think just recently, I can't remember his name, but there was a well-regarded researcher. He was actually one of the ransomware bugs that was going around and encrypting all the information on people's laptops and computers and such, unless they paid a ransom. He decoded the some aspect of the command and control system on that, and actually was able to nip it in the bud by registering a domain that was on kind of its path of random domains that it was going to jump to in case previous ones got shut down, which is one of the mechanisms malware uses to stay online, is they just like have a crazy random path of things that they will register in the future, so they can keep ahead of shutdowns. But so that was interesting. He was kind of widely hailed as a kind of a micro hero, because this malware was doing things like infecting hospitals in the UK, and when all the computers were locked up, it was interfering with their ability to treat patients, and sometimes it was computers that were hooked to large pieces of medical equipment that they vitally needed. So it was a big deal that he was able to head that off. But and he was trying to kind of stay low key about it, but of course the journalists dug up his name and publicized him and kind of shoved him forward as a hero, which I think caused a little more scrutiny. And then they found some malware that he might have been involved with. Apparently was involved with authoring when he was much younger, like more than 10 years prior. And, next thing, it sounds like he was facing, criminal charges on that, which is always interesting when they go after people as adults for what they did as a kid. But, so, that's what you get for showing that you have superior skills. In any other field, I don't think anyone would go back that far and try to, retroactively attach kind of third-hand blame to someone for creating something that was then used by someone else for bad purposes. But, that's the kind of thing that goes on in the technology field because people are very superstitious about it. So, you shouldn't be afraid of the hackers any more than you're afraid of your mechanic. He could do all sorts of horrible things to your car, but he's probably not going to. I mean,
you haven't seen these like online exposés about how mechanics are doing all kinds of dastardly things to cars and then forcing you to pay for them?
Well, a couple are, but I'm telling you, mine isn't, because I don't have any mysterious problems that pop up after I go to my mechanic.
Your trust is so high, Duncan.
Yeah. No, it's not high. I just don't think that everyone is just innately evil. It comes out of fear. It comes out of suspecting the other guy is going to do something to you, so you do it to him first, right?
I knew you were going to hit me, so I just punched you first.
Exactly. Yeah. There are people out there. That's their worldview. That's kind of how they grew up. So, we got to be watchful for that. Let's. Speaking of malefactors, malwell doers, our good old friend Google, don't be evil, got into a little trouble with the EU again regarding Androids, and this is kind of a mixed bag. It's interesting. I admire some of the things the EU is doing because no one else is willing to do it, and other times, they kind of go too far, and they get a little full of themselves, and there you go. You need to have balances of power. Google can't have all the power. EU can't have all, governments can't have all the power. Anytime those relationships get too out of whack, it causes problems. But anyway, here is a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at twit.tv. This is This Week in Google 465, talking about the Google Android EU fine.
This is Twit. We are gathered together to speak of the $5 billion fine that was just leveled at Google. And I'm really curious. We had a debate. In fact, it got a little heated on Windows Weekly this morning because I think this is really kind of appalling. But I'd like to hear what you all think. The European Commission says there were 3 things that caused it to do this fine, 3 things that Google must correct in the next 90 days. It's abused its Android market dominance. It's all about Android in 3 ways. Bundling its search engine and Chrome apps into the operating system, number 1. Blocking phone makers. This one I agree with. Blocking phone makers from creating devices that run forked versions of Android. So Google, Android is open source. Anybody can use it. Amazon has, of course. Amazon is based, the Fire operating system is Android, but it doesn't have the Google Play Store or any of the Google services on it. And that's legal. It's legit. If you want the Google Play Store, you have to have Chrome, and the default search has to be Google in the phone. And this is the one that I disagree with. I think Google overstepped their bounds. They also apparently told phone makers, if you want Google services on your phones, you can't make any phones with pure Android. You can't make a non-Google phone. And then finally, and this is something Google had stopped a few years ago, made payments to certain large manufacturers and mobile network operators to exclusively bundle the search app on handsets. Google apparently learned about the EU investigation 4 years ago, and stopped doing that at that time. So really, 2 things Google still does, apparently. They must stop in the next 3 months. Google says they will appeal. And actually, I thought there was quite a good blog post by Sundar Pichai in which he said Android has created more choice.
Amen.
Yeah. And of course, the Windows people are going to be in favor of all of this because this is comparable in many ways to the antitrust attack on Microsoft in the 90s, bundling Internet Explorer, because, of course, that guaranteed that Internet Explorer would dominate everything, which was turned out to be.
Oh, I put a story up on the rundown, Mike, that goes into why it's different.
Yeah.
Yeah, we actually talked about this last week and why it was different. And Leo, I felt like you explained that pretty well.
I wish I could remember what I said.
Was it Kevin explained it pretty well? It was basically along the lines of, this is at the operating system. No, it wasn't at the operating system level.
So here, the biggest, now, of course, Mike covered this.
Yes,
I mean, you were the editor-in-chief of Windows Magazine at the time. Right. We covered it. It was exactly the DOJ investigation of Microsoft started when we launched Tech TV in 1998. And so we covered that for 6 years because that went on, and then later EU's action. I still don't think it's such a bad thing to bundle the browser in the operating system.
It's irrelevant. But the biggest difference, I think, is that the purpose of Windows was to behave as a platform for
others
apps. The purpose of Android is to get Google search in the people's hands. That Android exists probably because Google wants to make the world safe for its search engine and doesn't want just Apple taking over other companies. Because if there was no Android, right, and there were Symbian or whatever operating systems one could imagine for smartphones, they could all just say, well, you know what, Google's too dominant. We just won't have Google. We won't let Google on. And so that's why they came out with Android.
Well, I don't frankly like a world where there's iOS and Symbian is not a world I want to live in.
No, because it would be
iOS. I think it's more than just getting the browser in hands, though obviously from a business perspective. But I think it was really about trying to create a competitive marketplace, and by making it free. I mean, that's the problem, that antitrust laws are so outdated. what in other times would look like dumping is instead a great favor to consumers by making this free and getting more low-priced phones out there. And I also think Google doesn't do the wrong thing in requiring manufacturers to either do authorized Android or unauthorized Android. But to do both is going to be really brand confusing. And all this talk we hear about fragmentation, that would be even worse. So I think Google's perfectly right.
Stacey, go ahead.
Oh, no, I actually agree with Jeff on this, which is, whoa.
You had to say actually. You had to say actually agree.
Well, you know, there are topics, Jeff, where we disagree, but this one I'm with you. And I remember last week we kind of came to this conclusion. I think it's a good one, which is we don't have the antitrust infrastructure right now or the rules to govern the way we build hardware, software, and technology businesses today. So I think that's probably where we should take this in focus.
In the U.S., this isn't an issue because Android and iOS are roughly at parity, about 50% each. Right. So neither is dominant. There's no monopoly position. So it's not an issue. Apparently, in the EU, Google has not only 80% of all the search, it has 75% of all the phones.
Yeah.
So it is, I don't know if that's a monopoly, but it is fairly dominant. And the EU, and Jeff, you're the expert on EU antitrust law, seems to favor competition among companies, and so feels like that Google's dominant position makes it hard for others to compete. Well, I celebrate the fact that Google bought Android and kept it open source.
Yeah. Amen.
And they offer it for free to a lot of people. And if you would like the Google services, it doesn't seem to me unreasonable if you want the Play Store to say, well, you got to include Google services, which includes Chrome. Yeah, and that, by the way, that's driven by consumer demand. Consumers prefer an Android device with Google's Play Store on it than not. So consumers are saying that.
And it gives them an easier, I mean, if you have to make a slightly different version of your app for like the Android App Store, for example, that's going to eliminate choice in apps and make it more difficult for developers and quote unquote innovation, if that's where we're going to focus our innovation.
So the way I look at it is there are two big issues. One is market dominance, and the other is kind of lock-in. The whole assumption about market dominance is that you can exclude others from the marketplace.
Or use your dominance in one market to enter other markets.
And their other action against Google was very much like that in
with
terms
shopping.
Exactly. But here you have the two dominant operating systems, iOS and Android. And on the one hand, you have iOS, which is completely dominant. You know, you cannot install iOS on a phone that is not Apple's phone.
And you can put Chrome on iOS, but
you
it's not
can't
the
get an
default
app
browser.
that's not approved.
And as Sundar Pichai points out, 1,300 companies are running Android. Yeah, it is a very open system. There's a free version. It's creating all these other companies, including the most direct competitor to Google, which is Amazon. Amazon uses the free version of Android to basically compete directly against Google. So Amazon has all kinds of alternatives to the Google Play Store, to the content that Google is selling and stuff like that. And Google just allows this. That's how open they are. Their most direct competitor is basing their entire platform on Android, on the free version of Android. Like, if that isn't open, I don't know what is. You know, if that isn't a generous policy, I guess, for lack of a better term, I don't know what is. And Apple, you couldn't imagine anything like that from Apple.
No, you couldn't.
You can't uninstall Safari, but Sundar Pichai has on his blog post a GIF that shows you can remove Chrome from Android and install Opera in under 30 seconds.
Right.
So, I mean, it seems to me the opposite of anti-competitive, but...
And the browser doesn't really bring them huge advantage, right? They make their money on advertising on sites.
Yeah, but the browser is what gives them Google search.
Yeah, I understood. But search is only part of what they do now. They make their money from advertising, and much of that advertising is off of search.
Yeah, we're still working on sites. Opera Mini or...
So let me go back to your point about antitrust. Of course, the key difference between the U.S. and Europe is in the U.S. it's about consumer protection. In Europe, it's about company size. And you got too big. And there's no statutory definition of too big, but there's kind of a belief. So last week I couldn't be on the show because I was in Europe doing a few things, including going to the Gutenberg Museum. But I also met with the head of CNIL, the French Data Protection Authority, and another 10 people that she brought in for a conversation. And then I met with the head of digital in the German parliament, and then I just had a conversation with UK regulators. And it's an interesting shift in time right now, where I've been out there being very critical of EU regulation, and now suddenly they're willing to listen to that viewpoint.
Interesting.
And I think that what we've seen in European regulation is that they're recognizing that it's protectionist. Dorothea Baer, the German MP who spoke at this conference where I was, the publishing company that throws the conference, DLD, an executive there did a speech beforehand in which he was trying to say, we got to be innovative, we got to be reasonable, and we got to be realistic like Jeff Jarvis. Okay, great. But then he defended the Leistungsschutzrecht. He defended the regulation they have. But then she got up as a member of parliament, and she's a conservative member of parliament, but she scolded the publishers, and she scolded them and said, this is protectionist. And it's not appropriate for the time and for the year. So there's a time right now, there's a little window I see where regulators may be open to different perspectives on this. And in France, I had a reasonable discussion too. They were considering a fake news law that has huge problems. In the UK as well. So what we see happening is we see the courts with the right to be forgotten. We see the antitrust regulators with this antitrust effort, which was really pushed very hard by publishers in Germany. And then we have legislation going after things like privacy, GDPR, and hate speech and all that. So there's this huge, my second point is regulatory reflex in Europe. And when I sat down and talked to them, it was kind of, well, we're going to regulate. How should we? Rather than starting and saying, well, is there a problem we should deal with?
Can I just say, completely parenthetically, how refreshing it is to hear opposing viewpoints debated in a rational, sensible way, and then a consensus attempt to reach consensus.
Europe.
Wow, how sophisticated those Europeans are.
Amen. Amen, brother. Amen.
Jesus. Okay.
It was kind of great.
It's interesting. So there is a little shift away from this.
I sense an opening. I sense it, not a shift, but an opening to have a different kind of conversation, and I welcome that tremendously. And so I'm not against all regulation. I'm for smart regulation that starts with evidence of harm and evidence of issues. So the issue back to
that's
Android
a good question. Where is the evidence
harm?
of harm? That's a very good point.
Where's the harm?
Yeah.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. That was a Creative Commons clip from the good folks at twit.tv this week in Google 465 talking about the Android find at Google. So, yeah, I'm kind of with Leo on that one. The thing where they were saying if you use their version of Android that you can't sell any other variations of Android. That sort of reminds me of what Microsoft used to do, where they're saying if you sold Microsoft Windows, you couldn't sell any other operating system.
Right.
You remember that?
Oh yeah, you're locking in the supply chain.
And as I recall, that led to what the antitrust case against Microsoft. That was one of many things where they were, it's okay to have a monopoly, but to use monopoly powers to suppress competition in the is not allowed directly.
Yeah, that case was a little bit more nuanced, though, behind the scenes.
Lots of stuff. Yeah, there's tons of things there. But that was just
technically you're a monopoly, but we rely on your products to run the military, and so if we disband you, then it's going to create a military problem, and it's also running the government, and then we're going to have a government problem. So let's slap you a little bit. But not
tenderize you just a little bit.
But not shoot ourselves in the foot. And by the way, because you're involved in all the espionage over in China, getting information from them, if we nix your product, and that's going to, disable our ability to get critical information. So all of that played into it, which the average consumer knew nothing about.
Yeah, that was indeed a good sample of the bigger picture.
Are there an extra 8 million lines of code in that operating system, and what are they doing? That was the question.
Well, yeah.
It's kind of like DNA.
I think it's
what is the other 95% of our DNA that isn't doing anything supposedly there for?
Oh, Nate, I don't know. Have you ever heard of a software project that over time didn't just get bigger and bigger and better, no matter how simple the process was?
I have.
Because they call
only one.
Kitchen sink, everything.
Yes, I know of only one.
You know of only one.
I know of only one. Yes.
It gets bigger or it doesn't get bigger?
Doesn't get bigger.
Oh, and that would be BSD?
No, that one gets bigger too. No, it was the shuttle control computer for the space shuttle,
that's
which
right.
was responsible for automated landing.
Yeah.
And no, they designed it right from the get-go, and
don't touch it.
They didn't touch it after that.
Yeah.
Because every digit was worth something. It had less memory than a floppy drive.
And that is a little bit of a challenge to achieve. But yeah, they did pretty much objectively correct coding on that. You go through that thing with a fine-tooth comb, and it's like, yeah, this just works. They have discovered, kind of different than, is I don't know, semi-commonly known, that there is no such thing as a completely debugged program. They have actually, in simple cases, been able to authenticate that there is no execution path that could do anything that it's not supposed to do. But it's a very exhaustive process. It can and it's kind of goes up exponentially with the complexity of the software, and and then throw a few more exponents on that if it's interacting with other software. So often, what kind of one method of safe programming right now is you make a very simple module that is verifiably correct, that is 100% of the interface, and then it is the only thing that's allowed to talk to the more sophisticated parts of the programming, like say in a Predator drone, that where you really can't afford to have garbage in causing problems. And even then, you can still monkey with the GPS signals going in. So it's doing the correct thing on the incorrect data.
It's that extraterrestrial kid playing with his game console that's monkeying with the drones.
Yeah, that's I think that's the behind Dome was the extraterrestrial kid or something, just decided to put a city under a jar, something like that. All right, let's move on to other amusing other government moves that look amusing in the wide angle. So we'll see if there's some sense or not to this, but this is a twit.tv Creative Commons clip from This Week in Enterprise Tech, 299, talking about the DoD looking for, putting out bids for an assistant, something along the lines of the old Microsoft Word Clippy, to help them classify documents.
This is Twit. We've all heard about lots of sensitive data leaking from the DoD, either through personal emails or just storing documents on their personal devices. But we all know humans are fickle, and sometimes they make mistakes, and relying on them to keep our data safe and secret is not always the best policy or defense. Well, the DoD is finally taking a step to make this better. They have issued a request for information, RFI, from the industry for technology that will prevent the mislabeling and accidental or deliberate access and sharing of sensitive documents and data. Now, the DoD is part of the Office of Secretary of Defense, and they're basically saying investigating the use of commercial solutions for labeling and controlling access to sensitive information. Now, the defense IT officials are also seeking software that must be able to make real-time decisions about the classification level of the information and the individual ability to access, change, delete, receive, or forward the information based on the credentials of the sending and receiving individual facility and system. Sound familiar? Well, if you remember that Office assistant back from 2003, that wonderful Clippy, well, it sounds like the DoD is looking for classification Clippy. Rather than an autonomous machine learning system, the DoD is looking for an expert system that will advise humans and prevent making mistakes and inadvertent disclosure sharing by offering suggestions. Of course, the DoD also wants the system to properly assign security attributes to non-human readable data formats, including binary files, images, video, and audio files, so that the system can properly determine whether a given user should allow access or not. Of course, there is a stipulation. They want the software to make sure it works with things like Microsoft Office products, including Office Exchange, SharePoint, and Lync. And of course, the DISA supplies Exchange email and SharePoint and Lync as enterprises to the DoD. All right, so my first question, it goes over to you, Curtis. Is it about time that the DoD and other organizations are taking control of their data here? I mean, this sounds like they should have been doing this a long time ago.
Well, I think we can say that they have been doing it. The problem is that the government now classifies so very many pieces of information. I was doing some looking, and the last time we saw any numbers on this at all was back around 2016, and it talked about how many tens of millions of documents a year are classified. So we're getting to the point where the volume is such that it's very difficult for human beings to adequately deal with it. Now, there's a separate conversation to be had about whether we should be classifying this many pieces of information, whether every document that is being classified should be classified. But again, that's a different discussion. I think we've hit the point where the government, as with many companies, has to deal with a volume that makes some sort of automated tool, whether it's machine learning, artificial intelligence, whatever term you want to use to describe it, that tool is going to be vital if they're going to stay current. And believe me, there are all kinds of complications that come from an excessively long delay in classifying any given document.
Right. So, Brian, you kind of have a little bit of experience with this. It's not easy to tag and classify documents, correct?
Not at all. So, having built enterprise systems in my prior life before F5 and worked with these systems now at F5, just to make document data searchable is really difficult. And really, people think, oh, just index all the text in it, and that's not really what you want. You want it tagged in a certain way so we can classify it and categorize it. But when users are entering that data about their own documents, when you're relying on data user entry, it's very unreliable and it doesn't scale, because only some of the users that are really fastidious or really understand the importance of it are going to do that every time they enter a new document. So really, AI is where we do need to turn. Now, my question is the DoD really going to do an RFI and not include Google, who's quite obviously solved this problem at scale?
Right. Curtis, I want to ask you a question. So I think, a lot of times organizations, they tend to just kind of throw it in and say, okay, anything that you write is immediately secured under the highest security. Only you have access to it. And then you kind of have to opt in other people as you kind of add people to that. And then you can have systems that kind of verify if you're allowed to add those people or not. Is that something that organizations should be doing, rather than saying, hey, let me just go after the fact and go find all the documents in my organization that need to be secured using AI? Shouldn't they be starting at the creation side of things?
Well, if security was free, that would be a great way of doing things. But security isn't free, and it has costs at a number of different levels. One of them, of course, is the simple hardware and software required to properly secure things at the highest level. And that typically, especially on the government level, includes things like advanced biometrics and other multi-factor authentication requirements. Imagine if we started out with that being the default for every document that's created. The other cost comes in the transactional cost, if you will, the friction that great levels of classification add to the system. And most of the systems we use in business and government just are too inefficient already. Throw in that much friction, and you're going to bring things to a grinding halt. So I would make the argument that from an economic standpoint, the proper response is to take it from the other point of view, that the default is that something is open unless there's some sort of clear and compelling reason to tag it with a higher level of classification or sensitivity. I think doing that and forcing people to think about it is the right way, because that lets human beings be involved where they need to be, making decisions, and allows for automation in the things that follow that, doing all of the tagging, all the marking, all of the classifying that comes from the human decisions.
Right. It's interesting that you said that humans should be making decisions. I actually saw a survey recently of cybersecurity professionals, and the stats said that 30% of people claim to be very knowledgeable about machine learning and AI in relation to cybersecurity analytics and operations, but only 12% have deployed or plan to deploy machine learning and AI for analytics and operations. So, to me, I want to throw it over to you, Brian. It sounds like organizations are not making the right decisions here. Is it just education and awareness?
I think it's availability of quality solutions that are easy to deploy. Now, when I say that, I mean, you might say 30% have knowledge in this area and only 12% want to have plans to deploy it, because, how many systems really are there out there that have a really good comprehensive implementation of machine learning and AI. I mean, we see that in every cybersecurity conference. You go to Black Hat or DEF CON or RSA, probably more famously, and you'll see the machine learning AI buzzwords flash here, there, and everywhere. Everybody's got it in their product, but who's really deploying it in their product in a way that's meaningful, in a way that's usable for the typical enterprise? And I don't think there's a lot of examples of that going around. Probably the only one that's even creditable, and I'm not even sure if this is fair, is the use of Watson over at IBM.
Right. Yeah, I think that the interesting thing here is that I guess it does make sense to, like Curtis was saying, to come from the other side. Is obviously they have all these documents, this information already out there. So kind of having AI, machine learning, kind of jump in, be applied as policy across the organization, and to try starting to do detection and logging and key logging is a good way to kind of rein everybody back in. But again, like you guys were saying, sometimes this doesn't need to be the only level of security that needs to be in there. They need to start adding additional layers in there to ensure that things are secure. But we'll have to see what goes on. We'll have to see what kind of things they decide to pick. We might never know, but we do know that there are solutions out there that can help them. So we'll see where we go from there.
And you're listening to Northwest Tech Show on KMUZ. I'm Dave Duncan, joined by Nate Darnell, and also joined by James Pierce. Hey, James.
Hey, everybody.
So James was checking out the station and had, right off I could see he had a little bit of a background for this sort of thing. So, you were talking about kind of you had some military experience and you're saying the search technology was not the best in that department?
No, it wasn't. You would search for something and you'd get a lot of things with similar keywords, but it would come up with hundreds of results that didn't have anything to do with what you were looking for most of the time.
So it didn't look like it had that Google juice on it.
No, it did not.
So I don't know, Nate. What do you think? Is this a fool's errand trying to get artificial intelligence to help out with classification?
No, I think it's doable. I think the problem is that I think there's a level of soft decision making that the human being still has, as long as we rear the human being correctly.
Yep.
And they learn proper arithmetic and reading and writing skills when they're younger, and proper interpersonal communication skills. They do generally have a much more skilled ability to look at things from a soft perspective and gray areas and be able to make good judgment calls. This is where software tends to still really be inadequate. It can make black and white decisions.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of gray areas where it's still just not really ready. And, there are a lot of, everybody's trying to deploy it because it's cool and, they want to be on the leading edge because it's the in vogue thing now. But look, it was in vogue 20 years ago. And what it boils down to is that it's a new era of artificial intelligence, which is a bit more sophisticated, more storage capacity. It's certainly more capable. But ultimately, I don't know. I mean, I think the bigger issue is I don't think we have correct policies in place. And I think the government might be able to use it, but I think the bigger issue is I don't think the government has the intelligence at the leadership level to be able to steward it correctly.
Yeah.
I mean, look what they're doing to our government already. I mean, they're all just a whole bunch of children that are touching people inappropriately and spending money inappropriately and making money inappropriately.
No. Okay.
Doesn't matter what party they're with.
Interesting points. James, any last words for? I know you got to jump out of here.
Yeah, I kind of do see the value in kind of an AI machine learning type of algorithm applied to government computers. There's a lot of foolish things people do on their computer, open up bad attachments that have viruses and stuff in it. So if you had something similar to a Clippy that would go, maybe you shouldn't do this, it might empower the individual to be able to make better decisions with what they do with classified data, I think. But there is always that, like the computer's always watching you, Big Brother kind of thing that I also see coming out of that. Like in that movie Fahrenheit 451, he had Yuxi. I see something similar to that going on, where
Sounds
it's
like
always
it should be a search engine.
Always watching, always listening. So I see it from two different sides, but I definitely see its value.
Well, a lot of these AI systems, they really need to have a good sample size of correct labeling of things to kind of get a sense of it. And then there's also the net value of information in aggregate. So I know that they started to super classify things because if you take how many rivets were shipped and how many people did overtime here at the shipyard and all this stuff, all of a sudden you run that through an analysis engine and you find out how many submarine that they got a new submarine that they're turning out. So sometimes the the aggregate is more than the individual items. So I don't know. It seems like they should be able to do some broad classification on what is likely to be sensitive, what is likely to, be okay. And then, when someone actually does a Freedom of Information Act or something, then they give them a little more. But tricky stuff.
If I trusted the military to look for the best instead of the cheapest, I would definitely say it would be a good tool for a lot of people. But from my personal experience, they like to find the contractor who will do it for the cheapest, not necessarily the contractor who has the best record and can do it with the highest level of quality.
Cheap price, good handshake. Let's buy.
It's funny too because then they'll spend $23,000 on a hammer. So they kind of have I don't know what they're doing with their money there, but
well. It might just fall under. You never know until you try.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thanks, James. I know you got to run. Thanks for joining us for a little bit.
Having me.
I'll giving you some off-camera cover here so you can run off.
All right. Thanks.
All right. And we're coming down to the bottom of the hour. And I will just finish up with saying that the Microportal Electronics Club had their meeting last night over Broadway Coffee House, as they do when the Shemeketa classroom is not available. And we had some good times going over a neat little application that someone had on Android phone. It was also on iOS that allowed you to do Bluetooth communications directly. So he was controlling his little Bluetooth robot through an Android app, which was kind of fun. Basically a programmable remote control. I'm going to see if that is usable with my Comcast gear. That could be kind of fun. And that's about it for right now. As I mentioned before, the Hackers on Planet Earth, the Hope Conference, had their meeting in New York City this past weekend. They do that every 2 years now. And this is what they're calling Hope 12, Circle of Hope. So if you go to, if you Google for livestream.com, and then put a space, and then put in quotes, Circle of Hope, quote, then you'll get a hold of some of the talks that were there. And they had 3 different names of rooms that they were having the talks in. So, depending on which one you pick, you'll get a different set of talks. So that's kind of my tech participation tip of the week. And with that, you've done it again. You've spent an hour talking tech with Dave and Nate. I hope you'll join us to continue this conversation next week and every week, Wednesdays, noon to 1 o'clock on Northwest Tech Show.